So the topic today is the Mass-Psychology of Fundamentalism. This will be the only topic for this fall series. In the spring we'll go back to the regular 2, possibly 3. If Dr. Schiff comes in the spring, we might add an additional duet event. Hopefully by that time we'll be back at our downtown setting. It's a little bit more commodious, or possibly at the new school. I'm discussing with some people there about the possibility of starting to use some of that space. Okay, the topic again is the Mass-Psychology of Fundamentalism. I really morphed the title in order to address, I think, an issue which in fact, I think Reich does address really in the Mass-Psychology of Fascism, but I think presents a more pressing circumstance today, especially since in the heat and passion and anxiety, both individually and nationally, the tendency has been to demonize and to choose one particular target for perception of who the enemy is and what the problem is. When in fact, I think we can, if we understand Reich's analysis, the enemy is among us. The enemy, the specific enemy who has to be held accountable is not necessarily the deepest nature of the problem. I mean, in some ways, Arab fundamentalism, Muslim fundamentalism, or certainly the more extreme forms of fundamentalism in Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and other groups, Taliban, and etc., Iranians, are essentially a virulent form of a more profound disorder, and in fact an easier target than the deeper issues of fundamentalism that exists transnationally and basically internationally. And really the issue of the nature of human structure and human developmental process. Okay. So what I would like to do, Dr. Schiff will respond after I do a presentation, then we'll open it for questions and answers and opinions. And knowing this group, at least most of you, I know there'll be a lot of opinions, and which is fine. Let me to give some background, at least to set the record straight. Reich by 1926, Reich was beginning to attempt a synthesis of Marxist critique, Marxist analysis, and psychoanalytic theory, certainly particularly psychoanalytic theory consistent with his own work that had been really pushing psychoanalytic theory further than the limits of Freud's initial presentation, particularly in the area of human social behavior. And began initially by producing a work which was a synthesis of Marxist materialism and psychoanalytic theory, and then moved on from there and let it grow from there, and finally produced the Mass-Psychology of Fascism, which went through then about 3 or 4 metamorphoses, finally being published in 1941 as the edition that we pretty much know, that was translated into English, with the addition of his work in what became vegetotherapy in the 30s, and then what became orgone therapy, orgone science in the late 30s and early 40s. Now, the mass psychology that we know and have is pretty consistent with the work he did back into the late 20s and early 30s. So there isn't, the additions are really what Reich tended to do with most of his work. If you look at character analysis or even the initial edition writings of Function of the Orgasm, he tended to not so much rewrite them as add on layers based on new developments. So subsequent editions added sections or revised or footnoted things that were discovered. The basic premise of the mass psychology is really astoundingly simple. It's one of those things that's become fairly available in most pop, social psychology premises, which is that the key to the structure of individuals in a society is the family, which essentially is the pathogenic agent or the socialization agent for any social cultural grouping, and in a sense prepares the individual, or in a sense, if we see the individual as an organism that is being planted and nurtured in order to grow into what is considered a viable member of the group, or plant in a sense, in the crop, has to find a kind of nurturant environment that's consistent with what the larger environment intends for its overall function in society. In other words, you don't want to raise an individual who is very, very creative and very, very independent and very, very socially gregarious and outgoing and loving in a society that has very, very little use for that. And now there are interesting phenomena that actually James DeMayo out in Oregon now has done some interesting work in looking at socio-economic and environmental and geological and climatological phenomena in response to social patterns. And I think there's some valuable work there, but the essential mechanism, what I'm more interested in, as was Reich, are the mechanisms by which behavioral and biological structure in organisms is transmitted. Okay? And those mechanisms really center on the primary path for transmission, which is the interpersonal, what Daniel Stern, the child developmentalist, would call the interpersonal relationship between the mother and infant. Okay? Now that can vary. The mother can be a surrogate or secondary caregiver. It's not crucial. In fact, for certain kinds of outcomes, secondary caregivers and removal from the primary caregiver or mother is beneficial in terms of producing types of pathology. But within that mechanism of the interpersonal relationship between child and mother, the mother represents, in fact, as always, the prime representative of the society. Okay? And this is crucial, so that when we talk about patriarchal societies and we're looking for patriarchs, the tendency is always to assume that the patriarch is who? The father. But in fact, as Reich points out very, very, very perceptively, that the patriarch in the traditional patriarchal, and particularly in the Orthodox patriarchal environment, is always the mother. Because she is the active representative of the patriarchal authority and the active transmitter of those values. And in fact, what is often very, very disturbing when we look at very, very traditional and rigid socio-biological communities, the mothers are usually the most avid perpetrators of the basic patterns for socialization and for repression and for inculcating sex, what we would call sex-negative behaviors and situations. Now, that is not to blame the mother. I mean, she is simply operating often in a context in which she's been conditioned to operate that. And obviously there are mothers and individuals who rebel or resist, but not without great penalty. Okay? And so that's the problem. And this becomes the key element in understanding where fundamentalism comes from as a basic agent of structural development. Okay? it's easy to start out with the assumption that you have societies that are repressive, and therefore the people just become part of the repressive system. But which led to the grave mistakes in trying to understand the rise of fascism, which is why Reich was writing at the time, the Mass-Psychology. Among all the European intellectuals worldwide, there was a profound, if you go back into the 1920s, a profound misunderstanding about what fascism was and where its roots were and what its mechanisms for successful transmission and successful expansion were. And Reich was the first to point out that the key had nothing to do with the politics of fascism. It had nothing to do with the agenda of fascism. It had nothing to do with what specifically the political parties were proposing, although obviously it had profound implications later. What really was crucial was that the individuals who represented the presentation of fascism to the public were incredibly in tune with and in touch with the fundamental structures of the mass of organisms operating in those societies. Okay? So that Reich points out very, very early on, and I think crucially, that it was a profound mistake, and which is exactly what's happened, of course, worldwide. When we look at Hitler and the rise of Hitler and even Mussolini, where people tend to be a little more relaxed with Mussolini because he was Italian and a little bit more pompous and a little bit more easily, but nonetheless, I mean, Reich understood these were, you know, Mussolini, Franco, these representatives, the Japanese fascists, were essentially demonized, that it was Hirohito, that it was Hitler, that it was Mussolini who were the cause of the disasters in Europe and Asia, and just later on that Stalin was the prime reason why Soviet fascism, red fascism as Reich referred to, as I would refer to it, became so virulent, was that you had these demonic Svengali-like creatures who were so charismatic that people would blindly, zombie-like follow them, when in fact, Reich pointed out, and this was not the case at all. And in fact, when one looks at Hitler, when one reads Mein Kampf, which is an absolutely astoundingly brilliant work. Okay? I mean, it's disturbing, and it's not exactly you know, an easy read in some ways, although in other ways it is. It's quite lively and available and direct. But when one reads the literature of Mein Kampf, when one reads the literature in the popular journals and newspapers and pamphlets of the Nazi, the National Socialist groups, you see a kind of appeal not so much to a seducing of the population as much as a responding to the basic nature of the individuals in the society. I mean, the National Socialist propaganda circles, Goebbels particularly, had a brilliant sense of who the German people were and what they were looking for and longing for. And the reason was because in many ways, not in many ways, in almost all ways, Hitler and his inner circle were representatives. They were common. They were in touch with the common man.
They were doing what they profoundly believed.
Oh,
rather than doing trying to put something over on people.
Well, that too. Although that can be misleading, because we know from the private journals that they were perfectly willing to lie and mislead and misrepresent. But that was, of course, in the service of a fundamental, profound vision and truth. And besides, lying to those who were not, considered important or considered expendable was, in the cause of, in their ideas, truth. As I often point out to my students, in all contexts, that truth has nothing to do with the facts. Truth is what leads to warfare and destruction. I mean, you have your truth, I have my truth, and we have then a profound conflict. Okay, so truth is a very, very variable and problematic I mean, Galileo had the truth. He wound up incarcerated under house arrest for a good deal of his later life, so with his books banned. Again, the key element here is that in the initial response of these groups, and we use Hitler and the Nazis or the fascist movements because I think they are historically removed to some extent, so we can see the pattern of the mechanisms. And I think that's valuable, and we'll move on to looking at how this applies to things that are more specific today. But the pattern there is that Hitler really struck a chord and resonated with the, in quotes, average individual. He spoke to them. He spoke from them, as Reich says. He was among them. He was, albeit shrewder, more, driven, more committed to a course of action that the average individual would not undertake, because being, as Reich said, homo normalis, the average individual is too neurotic and too scared to really do anything bad or good.
Takes a psychopath to really get things going.
So that if you look at the inner circle around Hitler, the close groups, both from the early days before 1933 throughout, that he surrounds himself with absolutely astoundingly brilliant psychopathic individuals with some mixture of psychotic behavior, but the dominant structures were highly psychopathic, brilliant. Goebbels, there are numerous instances. One of the great anecdotal accounts, when I was in college, I had the opportunity to be in a course with the son of Hitler's first minister of culture. The family the mother had left and brought the children to this country by around 1933, just before the break, and divorced the father. And this guy grew up a really militant anti-fascist, but had a huge, he was 12 when the family was brought here, and so he had a huge memory of the events going on around, and he was present at the meeting to plan the Munich beer hall meeting, which was crucial in terms of swaying the public to their agenda in the 1933 elections, was held in his house, okay? And he remembers, being sent away but listening at the door. And he remembers hearing them all because they realized that there was a groundswell of popular support for this very limited party that had lost dismally in all the elections prior to that. And they were all talking about how they had to get a bigger bigger hall, because there were going to be thousands of people who wanted to get in. They couldn't fit them in. It was a hot summer, and it would be intolerable in there. And the only person who didn't speak was Goebbels for most of the meeting. They all yelled and screamed and pounded the tables with positions. And after they had all sort of worked out there, Goebbels simply said in a very, very dispassionate, quiet voice, he said, "Nope." He said, "We not only do not change the venue, we don't change the hall. When you get everybody in there, you close the doors and lock the windows and turn off the fans." Right? He said, "You're dealing with Germans." He said, "He's German middle class, the bourgeoisie." He said, "As long as they don't sweat and they keep their collars buttoned and their ties up and their jackets on, you can't get them to do anything. Get them to sweat, get them to open their collars, roll up their sleeves, you can lead them into, hell. They'll follow you any place. They'll do anything you want." And that was the kind of sensibility. And it always struck me that anecdotally, if it wasn't a true story, it was a great story in terms of perceiving how clear. And now that, to me, as Reich often says when he talks about Mein Kampf, is you read that, you hear that story, is a great insight into just how brilliant these individuals were in terms of their understanding of mass psychology and then their understanding of character analysis, even though they had, and psychoanalysis, even though they hadn't read it. I mean, not that they saw themselves as psychoanalytic or character analytic, but that they understood intuitively. And Reich always had that quality of being able to say, these are individuals who are brilliant, even if it's in the cause of something that is horrific, okay? And that's something I think as a cautionary point should always be remembered when we look at contemporary issues of dealing with fundamentals. The assumption that people like bin Laden or the various members of Al-Qaeda are, dumb Arabs or fools is a profound error, or that they are demons in the sense of, people who have no relationship to reason within their own framework or world, is a profound mistake and will not lead to any kind of understanding or addressing any of the deeper issues of what produces this kind of tragedy. And I don't, by tragedy, I'm not really talking specifically about the World Trade Center, which is a particular event along the road of many events that are tragic. Okay? So, what are those mechanisms? And for Reich, the key formula was always to point out that when you wanted to understand what the Nazis or the fascists represented, that you really had to look at it as a combining of nationalism, okay, and socialism. And if you add nationalism and socialism together, you get National Socialism, which was the formal name of the National Socialism or the Nazi Party. The Nazi is the acronym for National Socialist Party. Okay? And when one thinks of that, then one is struck with, okay, so is the rise of international groups like Al-Qaeda or what we call religious fundamentalist groups, are these groups nationalists? Are they National Socialists? And I think when you begin to really look at them in their structure and their formation, they are. But what they are not is national. It requires a reorganization of our understanding of what nationalism is, to realize that it is not simply a question of borders. It's not a question of whether it's Germany or Italy or Bosnia. That what you're really talking about is the articulation of an exclusive group identity, of a us against all others. Yeah, right. So that once you do that, the idea that you realize that the nationalism, and when you read Mass-Psychology, it's very clear that Reich is not specifically interested in the idea of nationalism as a purely socio-political definition of the boundaries of a country, German nationalism, because in fact what you could see is that German nationalism was irrelevant, because German nationalism certainly spread out into Austria, Poland, and other Ukraine, where they embraced a nationalist philosophy that centered around this kind of purity of the Aryan race, which expanded out. And I think that's the key, because the key element when you look at religious fundamentalism or religious fascism, as I would begin to look at it, is that these elements, okay, become the defining elements for the group identity. So that it's really not a question of whether you identify as an American in terms of your national roots. In fact, most of these groups really become trans-political, so that the group identity, or the nation, in a sense, becomes the nation of Islam, or the nation becomes the Hebrew nation, or the nation becomes the black nation, or the gay nation, or the psychoanalytic, in a sense, the psychoanalytic nation, or the ergonomic nation. You build these kinds of intense group identifications, which people then join and become locked to in terms of the dogmatic or political presentation. So that under these circumstances, you can get a religious nationalism or a political, non-specific geographic nationalism, and a kind of socialism. But here the key is, this is not necessarily socialism. When you look at this is not necessarily the socialism of Marx or necessarily, or could be, but or even or Fourier or any of the early more, or Michael Harrington. It's not a humanist socialism. It's a sense of social leveling. And interestingly, when one looks at most of the intense fundamentalist groups, particularly religious fundamentalist groups like Muslim fundamentalist groups, Jewish fundamentalist groups, Christian fundamentalist groups, there's an incredible amount of sense of social leveling. And the interesting thing is that part of what has happened among the Islamic fundamentalists is this idea that all wealth is at the service of the cause. So that part of the appeal of someone like bin Laden is he represents a kind of ideal in Muslim theology that is very, very appealing, which is that you give of your wealth, that no matter how much wealth you have, you basically disperse it to the people in the court. What?
Asceticism.
Asceticism, but more specifically that all share in the wealth, and the wealth is always directed towards the cause. And so that this becomes a kind of primitive socialism, not a socialism with a concept of like a Michael Harrington socialism, a socialist humanist position of spreading the wealth rationally and creating more vital sense of work and reorganization of work and crossing national boundaries to.
This was not the case with the Nazis, though.
Yes, it was. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, well. There was a kind of cynicism behind this, in that, but the fundamental presentation of the Nazi position, and most people miss this, as with the fascists in Italy. Mussolini was a militant socialist and fascism grows out of socialism. And the fundamental agenda, most people don't read Mein Kampf and don't read Mussolini's speeches because one is a little bit bearing and not unless you're a scholar. But if you read them, the specific political and economic programs were nationalist and socialist, spreading the wealth, equalizing. Now, in reality, behind what?
Like the Volkswagen.
The Volkswagen, yeah, Volkswagen. The Volkswagen is the people's. And there's a new book just came out by Neil Baldwin on Henry Ford's relationship to the Nazi, the National Socialist movement. And Ford was very, very pro-Christian. Was a Christian fundamentalist who saw himself very, very much represented by the direction of the Nazi movement, and in Nazi headquarters there are photographs of pictures of Ford and Hitler together, and Volkswagen was clearly, and we know from writing, Volkswagen was Hitler's directive to create a Model T program in
But you didn't notice
Germany.
Ford sharing his wealth.
No, that's not true, as a matter of fact.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He had a very primitive socialist position that if you lived in if you worked in Dearborn, right, you got housing, you had health benefits, albeit controlled by Ford, and you had to live by his rules, which had to be no sex, your children had to be raised in a certain way. They actually sent representatives from house to house to see that you were living, you had to be temperate. It was a very fascinating,
He was planning to set up large communities for his workers where they would have homesteads they could raise their stock.
Right, no, there was a very, very primitive kind of Christian fundamentalist socialism and mixed with a patriotism, certainly with Americanism, but an internationalism also, in the sense that he found reverberations in other areas, as in Germany.
I must say that's one of the things about Kennedy's acceptance speech that really bothered me. I didn't really know at the time, but it fits into this thing when he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." There's also a form of that concept, and I felt that he got it backwards at the time, and I still feel that way.
Well, I mean, I don't think so much backwards as always in this situation. It's a question of whether we have rational, what Reich later talks about at the end of Mass-Psychology, which is the issue of the speculation on whether you could develop a work democracy which is crucial, whether you could have a society that was organized around the vital life functions of the group and reflected as in simple societies. See, in simple hunting and gathering societies, what's very interesting, particularly the anthropology that becomes available from 1960 on, which Reich had only limited access to in the 40s and 50s, because there just wasn't that much available except through the work of Malinowski. What's very interesting about simple hunting and gathering societies is that egalitarian, right, in a sense, they're primitive communist societies, and the society is organized around the vital life functions of the organisms in the society. Now, the society is a reflection of the life of the members rather than a imposed, organized system that is imposed on the members. In mass psychology, you get the reverse. Why that happens and why that's necessary, I suspect, as Dr. Sobey and I often talked about, Reich doesn't specifically address it, but implies, but I think it's absolutely clear that this is a condition of population pathology. I mean, the population explosion as societies get...
Patriarchal...
patriarchy...
All those other societies were matriarchal.
Which other societies?
The primitive hunting gathering societies.
No, big mistake is simple societies are never matriarchal. They're matrifocal. And there's a profound difference. Matriarchy implies rule by women.
No, I thought it implied the line of descendancy passes down to the woman.
No, but rule by women through their line, right? In fact, one of the greatest patriarchies known to in history was the Iroquois Federation, right? Except it was a matriarchal. Not matriarchal, matrilineal. Matrilineal means descent through the line of the mother.
Malinowski talks about a matriarchal society,
there's often,
and they weren't ruled by women.
No. Often the mistake is in the use of language. The three key words here are matrilineal, matrifocal, and matriarchal. Matriarchal means specifically rule by the woman. Matrilineal means descent. Now, most of what is often commonly called matriarchal societies that we know of historically were in fact not matriarchal. They were highly patriarchal, but they were matrilineal. In Iroquois nation, you became you received your power as a male through the woman's line, but basically it was a brutal patriarchal society. In simple hunting and gathering societies, what's fascinating is that they are not matriarchal, they are matrilineal, and more significantly, they are matrifocal, meaning that they are women-centered. In women-centered societies that we have examples of, as with the Kung Bushmen or some of the Amazonian groups, the primary social organization is non-hierarchical, right? Work-centered, and more significantly, egalitarian. Men and women tend to hold equal position in the society. So that this is a very, very different fundamental organization. And the reason I digress in this way is because Reich in Mass Psychology points out, when he talks about work democracy, he is struggling with the idea that that is probably the fundamental core of what a work democratic system would be. That it would be child-centered, woman-centered, and don't forget, among primates, where are men usually?
The men are hanging around where the women are.
They're really on the periphery.
That's what I mean.
They guard and they come in for a little visit, as my wife says, to move the piano, or something like that, because they're bigger and stronger. But basically, they exist on the periphery. Women are the center with the young. And so that kind of model has a very, very, you organize society differently if you do it that way, okay? So this kind of system then produces what Reich would call fascism, what I would say is also a kind of fundamentalism, a kind of rigid, or if I had to define fundamentalism, it's really not so much an issue of what it's applied to, whether it's applied to religion or politics, but it is a rigid, highly fixed and immobile structure around any set of given dogmatic positions. It's really the specifics are somewhat irrelevant in terms of the mechanisms. Now, where Reich also makes a profound contribution is in our understanding of what the mechanisms for the transmission of and the preparation of individuals to exist in this kind of fundamentalist or fascist environment. And there, the individual has to be raised to present a character structure and a physical structure, or armoring as we would call it, that would tolerate and fit in and find a place in that environment, okay, comfortably, and with little conflict, okay? Which is, once you begin to understand that, you have less trouble. You know, people will look at fundamentalists from any ilk, you know, Christian, Jewish, you know, Muslim, Buddhist, any these militant fundamentalists, communist fundamentalists. I grew up with them, you know, Stalinist, you know, who will take positions that just seem, how can anyone think that way? I mean, it's just so patently insane. I mean, you see, you know, kids today talking about, well, the attack on the World Trade Center was really a Zionist plot, you know, backed by America to blow up the towers to make it look bad for the Arabs. I mean, this is a standard line through, you know, on Al Jazeera, you know, TV. This is the standard view that this is a Zionist conspiracy. It wasn't Bin Laden at all. There's no, again, it's not a question of placing. You know, the issue is we hear these kinds of insane, you know, speculations that seem insane to us, patently insane, and we wonder how could these individuals believe that? But the issue is these individuals will believe what is necessary to believe depending on what the system presents to them, and they are fertile ground for it. They are prepared to you know, because of their basic self-interests. And their self-interests are to find ease and comfort in a system that's consistent with the structures that they bring to the socio, you know, environmental situation. And there the key then becomes how the individual is prepared. You still there?
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
You didn't expire in the meantime.
No. We had agreed that since Dr. Schiff felt that he didn't have that, you know, that much to add, specifically that I would do the primary presentation. Yeah.
Ask a silly question.
Yes. Oh, silly question. Okay.
Could you
Good.
give me a definition of fundamentalism?
Well, I thought I just did, but let me go back again. I think fundamentalism is essentially any kind of rigid, you know, restricted presentation of a set of political or social or interpersonal, you know, ideas about the way social relationships and personal relationships are maintained that are rigidly fixed, rigidly maintained, and dogmatically adhered to, or under pain of, you know, expulsion, really, or basically,
dominance, really.
and to maintain absolute dominance. In the fundamentalist frame, there is only us and them. Our position is right, and all other positions are wrong. There is no
How is
room
that
for
different from fascism?
It's not. Fascism is a form, is a political. That's the point of what I'm saying is that Reich at that point used the word fascism, but when you read Mass Psychology, it's very clear that he's not talking about specifically that political system at all. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons that many of the left liberals were first appealed to Mass Psychology, but then were put off by it, was that Reich was just as easily capable of saying, well, you know, you can have a liberal fascism too, you can have a liberal fundamentalism, you can have, because it has to do with the nature and rigidity of the structure.
So they're synonymous with one another, really?
With what?
Fundamentalism and fascism.
Well, they are just different words for, I think, essentially the same structure. Now, we might have to broaden, as I'm trying to do, the use of the definition, because fascism tends to be much more identified with a political agenda, political dogma, and often with specific national boundaries. Okay,
It comes to militarism. too.
and militarism, but we'll get to the issue of militarism. Yeah, I think the issue of militarism is simply what you use as a means for maintaining hegemony, dominance. Okay. Okay. So the issue then, if the key really, the deeper key, matter of fact, one of the big errors I think, and one of the things that's often missed, is that the next move is almost always to look at fascism or fundamentalism as a militant, militaristic, or violent movement, and to look at the broad agenda of terrorism, the broad agenda of military conflict, rather than going to a more minute examination or internal examination of the mechanisms of the preparation of individuals to participate in this world. So that when we see CNN do specials on, or 60 Minutes do specials on Muslim martyrs who are willing to blow themselves up, and we say, how could that be? That's so insane. Is that they're missing the point. What they're not looking at is how and what the mechanisms of raising individuals that are capable of that kind of behavior willingly and freely, with a kind of type of almost abandon. Okay, very much consistent with the problems that Americans had and the fascinations Americans had in the 40s during the conflict with the Second World War, particularly with Japan, with the idea of kamikaze pilots and whole populations of soldiers, chaining themselves in caves when they were burned alive by napalm and such, rather than surrender. We don't understand that, and we're fascinated, horrified and fascinated by it. But what is really missing, and Reich does talk about the Harry-Carry, the kamikaze, because he's very interested in it, and probably, to my sense of it, Reich's the only really effective description of what is happening when someone commits Harry-Carry, and what the mechanisms are underneath it that could bring an individual to that kind of what appears to anyone else outside of the system as crazy, mad, inconceivable. And yet Reich, I think, effectively shows that it operates quite rationally, given the nature of the pathology and the blocking and the armoring of the organism. So that when one does that, it may be possible to essentially understand this by looking at what it is, how a child could be raised to embrace or to feel comfortable in that kind of role. And clearly the mechanism here, you have to look to the initial interaction between the child and the mother. Okay? Realizing now that we look at the mother as the pathogenic agent, the representative of the larger social structure who's fulfilling particular conditions. So that if you take an organism, a living, breathing, pulsating organism, as Dr. Schiff often likes to describe when we talk about the nature, the fundamental nature of what organomic theory it works on, model works on, which is that it starts always with this fundamentally basic pulsation, expansion and contraction. So you have an organism that's born freely pulsating, and there's no indication in terms of any cross-cultural data and studies that I've been aware of that indicates that Arab babies or Muslim babies or Jewish Orthodox babies are born any less pulsatory or any less alive than any of the any other organisms. So once you have this,
mothers may be more blocked.
well, but that's true. But the babies are still basically there might be some initial blocks, but overall you have pulsatory organisms that are born. Once birth takes place, and I think Bob is raising a good point. It's possible that there were already some intrauterine deformations based on blocks and armoring in the mother. But that aside, which is, I think, an interesting topic, but possibly more addressed in some other context, once the organism is born, if the organism is born into an environment that is going to be affectionate, nurturant, and supportive of a kind of maintenance of that pulsatory process, you're going to have a very, very different course of action. Now, often what goes on in these places, and often what is missed, is, I remember Dr. Sobel and I talked about this, and he was very sharp on this, and it really alerted me to look at this, is that usually what happens is, in these societies, and it's true, if you look at perfect case example would be, say, Berber children. Berbers are the nomadic tribesmen, the great horsemen in the hills of Algeria and Morocco, nomadic. They were the bandits and the pirates of, that Teddy Roosevelt had conflict with. If you want to see sense of, the romantic sense of it, there's a thing called Wind and the Lion, with Sean Connery playing the Berber. It's a nice movie. But the Berbers are these really sort of ultimate, warriors. And they ride these Arabian stallions, and they owe allegiance to no man but their leader. And when you look at those societies, it's very interesting the way children are raised. Babies are born and raised initially only only with contact with the mothers, with women. They are continuously soothed through nursing and genital manipulation. It's very common. By the way, worldwide, genital manipulation of children as a way of soothing is a very, very common practice. It's often not talked about. It's a great way to put a baby to sleep. Put them on the breast and manipulate their genitals. Soothingly, they'll go.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, right. So, that's right. So then you say, well, what's wrong with that? Of course, in this society it would be called child abuse, but sexual abuse. But the key is, looks good for a while, right? Then the key is, and this is that at key points, particularly as the child becomes more operative, it's stopped, and often stopped quite violently and quite abruptly, and often with horrific. For instance, does anyone know the most common way to wean a baby in most simpler, more traditional societies?
They put bitter stuff on the nipple.
Right, you put bitter stuff on the nipple, or actually in most Middle Eastern and Mediterranean societies, you put not only bitter stuff, but you blacken or discolor the nipple. So that, it's interesting, right? So what in terms of, everyone said, oh, Reich was always so extreme, that babies have eye visual contact and have tactile contact and they're very alive, but you discolor, basically you make the nipple look horrible. And you make it taste horrible. And the baby gets on the nipple and it not only tastes horrible, so the baby does what it would do normally, which is, I watched this, I've seen films of this research. The baby pulls off the nipple, and then it does what it would naturally do, which is looks like, what the heck is this? And it looks, and what it sees is no longer the familiar, warm, visually gratifying image, that it's had an intimate contact with, but it sees this ugly, monstrous, deformed looking, breast, nipple, and aureola, rather, and basically it recoils even further, all right? And then the masturbation doesn't stop, but becomes erratic. Sometimes it's allowed, sometimes it's not. When the child begins to masturbate itself, it's sometimes allowed, sometimes it's not. Begins to set up a pattern of severe, unpredictability, and realistically, what the child does is what any rational organism would do, which is why? Contracts, and it begins to maintain the contraction permanently, because the inconsistency is, well, sometimes I can let it down, but if I let it down, there's no telling when it's going to happen to me. I'm going to get, hit. So the simple, efficient way to deal with it is to begin to harden yourself. Usually at that point, roughly around that time, the child is then separated from its mother if it's a boy and sent out into the men's world. And in most of these societies, just what's
What age was that?
well, it can vary by society. It would be hard to set. Usually around 3, which is
3?
Yeah.
Great.
Well, that's right.
Yeah. In some societies 7, in some societies only with puberty. For instance, in most
The Jewish society, that's the significance of
right.
the bar mitzvah.
Well, yeah, and in Muslim societies, in most Muslim societies, particularly in Iran and throughout much of Arab societies, male circumcision coincides with the males leaving the family, the women's world, and moving more into the world of men. And circumcision is done at 3. And now, here again, this is the mechanism. Gradually, as the child moves out into society, it gets reinforced with a kind of brutality, so that boys are encouraged to be in the company of men or other boys and to participate in activities that are considered masculinely appropriate, which are usually aggressive, usually predatorial in one way or another, and very, very, I use this word more generically rather than specific in terms of acts, but very homosexual, meaning all sexual direction, all sexual focus is on the community of men. Girls remain very, very much within the veil, not just physically within the veil in Muslim societies of the actual veil, but they remain in the inner world of women, which is essentially behind the walls in women's communities. And lest you think that those communities are free and loving communities, they are very rigidly maintained with a great deal of rules and regulations about how and what you are to be as a girl in that world and do. And certainly key to this is that any kind of sexual behavior and masturbatory behavior, any sexual pleasure is greatly punished and greatly threatened, okay? So that you begin to get this separation. With this, the society also encourages more and more kinds of behaviors that are punitive, so that we say there's male circumcision at 13 in most Arab societies, that circumcision is not, I had a patient, Iranian, who described what the trauma of his circumcision at age 13. You're taken out, you're circumcised without anesthesia, right, because you have to prove that you're a man. And they have these circumcision robes, white robes, which then become bloody. You're then placed on a stool and carried through the town, right, with a dunce cap on, what we call a dunce cap, right? And everybody laughs, the women come out and laugh and joke and tease, about the boy, right? So this is your, here you are, welcome, you're a man. Today you are a man.
Any history on who invented that one?
What?
Any history on who invented that one?
Who invented male? Who invented male circumcision for young? Now, as Reich pointed out, so we concurred, and I would fully concur. The act of male circumcision in infants is not necessarily less violent. It's just simply more passive.
As a matter of fact, that's more out front.
Right. And
Mine was just as bad, but it was more subtle.
It might have been. It might be less visually social, but certainly you're dealing with a young organism that is almost completely unarmored, and therefore the damage might well be more profound to the organism at birth or close to birth, and clearly. Does profound armoring and structural damage. Either way, these are acts. When you ask the question of where does it come from, the interesting thing is when you read the literature in the Bible, the Old Testament, the prescription for circumcision is based on a prayer that says this is an offering to God, right?
The covenant.
But it is said, it is with a caution, which is that this is delivered unto God so that you shall remember me, that God shall remember me.
That's pretty clear.
Right, that's right. And I've always pointed out that that you will always remember God if He's taking the tip of your penis. What I always wanted to know is there a place in heaven where all of these foreskins are just sort of like, sitting there for the last, gazillion years or whatever. But the point is that I think as often when you read things like the Bible, the truth of it, the fundamental rightness, the information is there, so that it is essentially a way of making that this is to make sure that the child never forgets who it is beholding to and who it is obligated to, and of course the God who is the representative of God.
Yeah, but I think it's also profound.
The father and the patriarch.
This is a symbol, really, of sexual repression.
Yes.
I want that statement in the Bible, so that you will always be sexually repressed.
No, not a symbol. It is a mechanism of sexual repression.
Just one quick question about in Moses' monotheism, Freud says or implies that this came out of Africa, came to the...
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
Who knows? I mean, it's certainly reasonable to assume that other groups have found other ways. I mean, it's not just the Jews that invented this. It's probably
some maniac self-mutilating or something like that.
No, I don't think it's maniac. I think these were consistent patterns in the tribal developments of of many different societies. It has more to do less with where it comes from than with changes in the political social organization of different groups who are becoming more, as groups become more highly organized states or tribal patriarchies, then you have to have ways of maintaining that. In order to maintain that, one of the ways of maintaining that is to begin to establish sexual repressive, sex-negative behaviors. One of the most profound sex-negative behaviors is genital mutilation. We're not even talking now about, we're talking about male circumcision, but we know more and more now about female circumcision, which is a consistently brutal pattern, and in some cases, depending on clitorectomies and even the more profound form of pharaonic circumcision, which of course is the sealing of the labia at birth, which is done to millions of girls worldwide, until marriage, when the girl is then the prize. It's like a chastity belt, the prize for the male who receives the girl, if she survives long enough, so she doesn't die from gynecological complications, urinary tract infections and such, which are rampant. He has the ritual right to cut her open, to open her, and all this is to hide. If you ask why, what they do? Well, no, I think we should. You're all getting nauseous, but I think you should understand these things as. Because people ask, what are the mechanisms? How does this happen? And the point is, these are the tip of the iceberg. This has nothing. This goes on at all sorts of levels. How you eat, how you sit at table, how you address individuals in the language, how you refer to certain individuals, how you're punished if you don't refer to certain individuals with the right authority, the hierarchical structures. I mean, we're talking now about, but in Hindu society, the nature of caste systems and positions, the rigidity. These are all maintained by highly ritualized, highly mechanized systems of limiting the pulsatory experience of the organism, restricting the activity, and then allowing only certain avenues of expression. One of the primary avenues of expression in most of these things, besides ritual behaviors within the particular religious or political arena, are expressions of extreme aggressive, often ritualized or politically approved sadism or violence. The single biggest one of which is hatred of others. So while you have to be totally subservient, totally respectful, totally rigidly locked into the rightness of the authority that you're born into, whether it's religious or political, that becomes intolerable. If you think of it in terms of expansion and contraction, it's becoming more and more packed. You get these kids who are growing up basically like time bombs, like pressure cookers.
Is this
So
of the whole Arab world?
It's not just the Arab world, it's in any world. It's among the Jews.
No. I mean, this 13-year-old with the bloody.
Oh, you
with
can't,
those
you can't get off of that image. Yeah.
Is that-
It varies in different. 13-year-old circumcision at puberty is consistent through Arab tradition, but the public displays, that's Iranian. I don't know if it exists in all Arab communities. Okay, but the point of all this is that you have a pressure cooker, and then what you do is the societies then say certain things are permitted to release that. One is hatred of others. So anyone who is not with us, you're allowed to vent.
Bush.
Well, you're allowed to vent your hatred on. Anyone who is not part of the power structure or the approved position. So men can hate women and treat women in a particularly subservient way. You can, you can have all sorts of dogmatic, religious, or political, assertions. But essentially, what they are really doing is allowing for certain sadistic attitudes and sadistic expressions towards individuals. So how do you raise your children while you're under law? You're raising children to be respectful and proper. The law allows you to beat your children, to brutalize your children, to terrorize your children, which appears to be training them to become members of the society and to learn how to be a member. But in reality, what it's also allowing is you as an individual to vent your sadistic impulse and to gain gratification in doing that, so that the mechanism serves two functions, which is release of the tension that's building up in you, and basically conditioning the younger organism to begin to operate in the same model. Now, the final and most profound expression of that, right, kind of discharge, sadistic, aggressive discharge, would be in military or aggressive physical conflict. In other words, you say, okay, now we're not only going to hate this group, but we're going to go after them and annihilate them, or brutalize them, or destroy them. And not only that, in the course of that, all the things that that the true people, right, us, would not do, you can do. You can rape, you can pillage, you can kill, you can, you can torture, because they're animals, because they're not of the group.
And then we're gonna get their women.
Well, but the women, that's all part of it. There you can have indiscriminate sexual, sadistic sexual behavior. That's fine, because it's not at the service of the true.
That's all really, that's a true, and it's a construct, because obviously, as soon as it becomes in the interest of a society to have its young not behave in their own best emotional interests and in ways that are in conflict with really what they might want to do, what they need to do is limit their sexuality.
Yeah, the issue I think here is not just limiting the sexual function is really a mechanism by which you really get access to limiting. I think is the movement of energy, is the rational pulsatory movement of energy, the natural pulsatory movement of energy. And that's what produces the kind of virulent explosions of potential, power that is so threatening and awesome. Okay, so then of course, once you have these armament organisms, the role of the environment, and here we then talk about where these organisms, like seeds, land, in what soil they land in, what kind of environmental conditions they grow in, and if they find soil that is consistent with that kind of pathology, they will grow very much as a tree. They will grow, but instead of growing straight, they will grow like a crooked tree, as Reich says, which of course can't be. It's still a tree, fulfilling much of the functions of the essential growth functions of the tree, but it is not it's a gnarled tree rather than a straight tree. And I think what you wind up with is a mass population of various types that are prepared to operate environmentally and socially in ways that are incredibly pathological and incredibly detrimental to a broad arena. And so that I think finally, for me to finish up here, my point would be that what we're talking about then is a mechanism that is a pathogenic agent to producing a systemic form, and I've used this, and people have sometimes thought that, because it's come up in the popular, media too, but it's often used as a metaphor. I don't use this as a metaphor. What we're dealing with is essentially condition, shrinking biopathy, as Reich would say, or cancer structure, but on a broad, organismic, plane. In other words, that you have masses of environmental cancers developing around and producing what we call fundamentalist movements and fundamentalist positions. But these are cancer in very much the way cancers develop in an individual biological organism. And they spread very much the way cancer spreads. And they are maintained very much the way cancers are maintained, basically by withdrawing energy from the living organism, and the organism surviving or trying to survive on less and less biological support. And that kind of cancer is very difficult. I mean, in one sense, you can root it out. Sometimes it's operative. You can actually surgically remove it, and it might, successfully stop the spread. But more often than not, it continues to grow. And the question really remains whether we've reached a critical mass, whether it's metastasized worldwide past the point of any kind of true treatment. And so what we're doing is keeping it alive for maybe another couple hundred years before it finally just collapses, or whether surgical removal at various crucial times will keep the organism going at least long enough for most of us to get out of it.
That's extremely accurate and terrifying.
No,
Do you see it seeping energy from people sucking?
Sucking energy from all of it? Yes,
Right.
of course. Why are we having this?
Right, I mean, people I believe that it is.
Why are we constantly obsessing about what's going on?
Right.
And what's frightening is most of the responses thus far, of course, to this particular outbreak of fundamentalism are probably not adequate. I mean, although I must say, and I want to be on record, I know some of you are more liberal, certainly, than I am, that I, definitely, support surgical removal of any kind
More
of.
the better.
But that the United States, as the surgeon, is probably not prepared to do the kind of radical surgery that's really necessary.
Could you imagine, just playing theorizing, that this kind of thing had happened, not in the World Trade Center in 2001, but about 1970 or 75 in the center of Moscow, the different reaction that would have occurred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's true. But again, I think also what we're looking at is a situation where the kinds of radical surgery that would be necessary don't only involve Muslim fundamentalists. I mean, it's easy to say we have to go after Iraq, maybe, and really Saudi Arabia, which is virtually impossible. Plus, and probably significant moves in Egypt. But that would only address the Muslim fundamentalists. There's nothing about the fundamentalism existing in our own country,
And in the Jewish,
and in Israel.
But
no
the
question
really
about it.
frightening thing that is, you simply do the math, and you realize that Orthodox Jews have 9 and 10 children,
Mhm.
the Muslims have
Yeah.
9, 10,
Yeah.
12
Oh,
children,
Yeah, but
and other people have,
That's
moderately reasonable people have 1.5.
Yeah, that's part of the power of the metastasized cancer. Is it that, as anyone knows anything about cancer function, knows that cancer cells proliferate much more rapidly than healthy cells. That's exactly why cancers eventually destroy the healthy organism. So with that, let me send if Dr. Schiff is still with us. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the end of my fundamental presentation. And if you have some comments, and then we'll have questions and answers as we go out. I'm going to go get a bagel while you're talking.
Well, my first comment is that, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First, I think that was a wonderful presentation. I come to this, coming to this morning and thinking about it, a lot of it is that, a lot of this I just don't understand. That was my sense coming here, and I feel I have a greater understanding right now, and I think that was a wonderful presentation, and I'm always impressed by how Dr. Lewis brings in from many different disciplines, which is so ergonomic. Kind of integrating anthropology and history and social theory, but putting it together in terms of its common functioning principles. So it was very rich for me. Saying that, I just have, one of the things I notice in terms of my own approach and how that differs from Dr. Lewis's, is that I often compare his breadth of his understanding, and I tend to be a little more narrow in my own focus, in my own overall reading, and so I tend to look at things maybe more just specifically as an ergonomist, as a therapist, as a psychologist, and so a little narrower and maybe a little more limited in that regard. However, I do have a few thoughts based from that perspective. One is pretty much what I think Dr. Lewis was addressing, and you were all talking about at the end, this whole kind of relationship between what's happening, fundamentalism as a cancer, and seeing it as a kind of a broad kind of phenomena or energetic phenomena that we can then reduce and see within the individual organism. Other people have said that the Earth is a planet, is alive, we have a pulsating Earth, pulsating atmosphere, and the same kind of principles, the same kind of energetic functioning goes on in the wider sphere as it's within our organism. And I think that's very, very important and kind of profound perspective. It also gives kind of understanding to maybe, the analogies between surgical removal of cancer, but then what's more necessary, not only surgical removal, but then creating environments that can recreate health or initially produce health so that cancer doesn't develop. But the other thing I think that's important is the whole idea of how we can find and look at any aspects of this fundamentalism or this kind of rigid us-them thinking or this hatred towards others or parts of ourselves within ourselves. Because essentially, this is what I often see and think about when I work with clients and also when I experience life, is that this whole mechanism of kind of finding our own group and being right, and then having to see others as wrong, and then additionally needing to destroy the other because somehow that others is different than us, they're not human, they're a threat in some way, and therefore then feeling threatened by them and needing to take action toward them is something that is within all of us to one degree or another. In fact, it's in our organisms. When I work with a patient and they're breathing, and then they experience a certain kind of sensation which they are unfamiliar with, which comes from an area of their organism that has been sequestered off, that has been kind of needed to be put away from them because it's been linked with fear, shame, dread, some sort of feeling. Usually, there is a desire to repudiate that, or it brings with them an enormous anxiety, or with that, it brings with them a reaction of anger. Often that can be a reaction of anger towards the conditions that bring it up, namely the therapy, or it can be a reaction of anger toward that impulse or that feeling or that sensation that arises. And essentially in that way, we're seeing on the physical level this kind of what happens when areas, when impulses, when feelings in the course of development become linked with anxiety, with shame, with guilt, with all these very aversive kind of emotions that make us want to distance ourselves from them. And in that distancing, we then end up then having to create barriers. In that distancing, we end up having to create organismic barriers and also barriers in our thought system. We can't go there. We've got to destroy that because it essentially evokes anxiety. So in that way, I see that's somehow within us the same kind of mechanism coming from the same kind of ground, and then that mechanism within ourselves through, as Dr. Lewis was well describing, the whole socialization process and the whole societal process that then funnels and channels the kind of frustration that we have when we've sequestered off certain aspects of ourselves, and then project those aspects of ourselves upon the other in the world. How then that becomes rigidified and then supported and encouraged by the society. What it seems to behoove us to do then, both in terms of ourselves and the world, is to really understand those mechanisms, both within ourselves, by that in terms of our kind of relationships with others and our relationships with ourselves. One final note on that, and there was just so much said, but one final note to that is that I see this often in working with couples, which is a very fascinating. One of the fascinating things about doing therapy, at least for me, is that it's such a observatory into how life functions, and it's also an observatory of how I function, and so it's so interesting in that regard. But when working with couples, it's so interesting to see the interpersonal dynamics that go on, and it's in vivo. It happens in the therapy room, where people cannot take on and understand another perspective, where a person has to rigidify, where the other's individuality, where the other's sense of their own feelings has to be somehow shunned because it creates a threat, or because the person cannot really let go of their position. And that is another kind of microcosm of the macrocosm, a microcosm of what's happening, I think, in the broader world. And it's also very much kind of indication of how these people or individuals as all of us were kind of raised, where there was a right and wrong, and where we have to then hold on to our position. Oftentimes, the treatment, if we call therapy treatment, is gradually for each individual to be able to, in their relationship, be able to come to terms and accept, be able to hear and feel what the other person is experiencing, and let down that kind of barrier. And in other words, kind of creating between themselves an interpersonal environment, which if they had grown up in, they would be already at a point where these kind of often difficulties would not occur within their relationship and within themselves. So, I don't know if any of that is meaningful at all to this discussion, but thoughts I had, and I'd love to participate in any questions.
No, I think that's very pertinent, and often in these kinds of discussions, it's easy to go to the broader issues. I think one of the unique things about Reich's work, often even when you read Mass-Psychology, is that he keeps bringing it back to how this is not about those other people who suffer from these kinds of mass psychological distortions, but that these are, I think, very pertinently reflections of all of our structures, all of our, that none of us, no matter how much work we've done or how fortunate we are, if we had relatively benign parenting or positive parenting, no matter what, we all are, exposed to these kinds of issues, and while we might not each be militant fundamentalists, we're all capable of behaviors that are consistent with the behaviors of the most virulent fundamentalists.
I would like to interject something.
Yeah.
I've thought about this. The quantity and the quality. If you have a limited number of people so thinking, or people with restraint on their aggressiveness, then you don't have those results, and therefore you've got fundamentalist Christians in the United States who are, in my personal opinion, very virulent and many of them destructive, but most of them are not going to really go out and
Yeah,
destroy.
but except as Reich points out, I think very clearly, and I think as Dr. Schiff is pointing out, since it's all present potentially with all of us, right, in some form, nascent as it well be, as contained as it might well be, that this is consistent with people trying to understand how is it that when Hitler came to power, suddenly all these respectable, very, very restricted individuals who would never harm anybody were suddenly out in the streets zig heiling and ready to give up their enemies. The same problems that existed, people can't understand. How are these people who lived in Bosnia able to suddenly turn on neighbors who they've intermarried with, who they have interpersonal relationship with, I remember just listening to a discussion of this on public radio, and support and actively participate in human, brutal sadistic behaviors. And I think Dr. Schiff is correct, is that the roots of that really are present in all of us, and I think Reich makes that clear. That I think is what he was saying. It's true, most of us, and certainly the position I've always said about the situation in Afghanistan or in Iraq or any place, as brutal as it is, I could have my opinions on the brutality of the life there. If it doesn't come into my neighborhood and doesn't interfere with my overall pursuit of my life, I probably wouldn't be concerned, enough to call a meeting or a discussion on it.
I want to check one,
Maybe
which is how much fear of these virulent forces acts upon others in the society who may be, the majority may not be, but there's certainly a large quantity, even in Germany, who are too afraid to resist it, yet they don't really behave in this fashion.
But again, the very fact of that fear and that inability to resist has a lot to do again with, as Dr. Schiff is saying, what is transmitted in the individual structure. At what point do we resist? At what point do we decide also, and it's always part of what I think many of you, what many of you people express, I think what Norman is getting at is American response, while it might be necessary to go after these groups, and have military action against them to crush them, for instance, is American attitude and response necessarily a sign of a healthy response to the threat, or is it also playing into inherent forms of sadism and sexual discharge in your community? Now that doesn't mean necessarily
governmental fascism, which is happening.
Yeah.
Restriction of our civil rights. So front page of the Times.
Well, again, civil rights. The whole issue. You can also wind up with a kind of what I would call a civil libertarian fascism too. The American Civil Liberties Union is not exactly what I would call a healthy, ergonomically, pulsatory functioning group. Reich was very interesting when offered the support of the American Civil Liberties Union, when he was under attack, refused it because he said essentially this was a very unhealthy, essentially fascist, organization in which the truth of its civil libertarian positions was hiding the lie of its more fundamentally. So I mean, civil liberties is a very, maybe we should do a topic on the issue of civil liberties. I mean, civil liberties is one of those dogmatic positions in America that often can be in the service of, you know, a kind of dogmatic fascism as much as I mean, many of the. I mean, I grew up in a liberal environment, and many of the and still. I'm still tolerated by many of my friends who and colleagues who are far more liberal than I am. But often liberalism is a cover for a deeper kind of
Father hate.
Well, maybe
Baker said, right?
Yeah, well, father hate or just, you know, hatred of authority, and so you know, the issue is not so much whether civil liberties. I don't feel my civil liberties are being trampled on. However, the response to the so-called threat of fundamentalism, or Muslim fundamentalism, is often at the service of deeper, structural, characterological, sadistic impulses that operate in our own society. So that when you get kids, for instance, who I have friends who have a friend out in Queens who was pistol whipped, by a gang. It was a kid who was actually was a not Muslim but a Sikh, kid who was surrounded and attacked and really brutalized, and girls who have been threatened. Now the issue is, what is that? Is that a reaction to what's going on internationally, or it becomes a principle that gives permission in a certain way. And this is very, very much the same mechanism that gave permission for the gangs to roam the streets in Vienna or in Berlin, during or for gangs to roam the streets in Italy, and on and on and on. So that this is, I think it's easy to have knee-jerk reactions to this. The thing to me, it seems that Reich offers always is the idea that don't assume that any of these behaviors are necessarily what they superficially appear to be. That you have to look at the underlying mechanisms and causes that unite all of these behaviors.
When I first read the Mass-Psychology of Fascism, for about the first third of the book, that one of the first things that hit me, I kept on saying to myself, every page he talks about sex.
Right.
Sex. I don't think there's a page in there where he doesn't mention sex, sexual. And then I thought, he's really going to turn everybody against him. And I really went into it. And finally, when I started to read a little bit further, I realized that a quote that he had said in one of his books came back to me. He says, everybody's always accusing me of always talking about sex, sex, sex. And I say to them, if you're talking about an automobile, and the automobile is not running, and you keep on talking about gas, 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 he said, nobody would say, it's the same, the simile works, and that's what I got out of the book. Yeah. Is that, and in every single page he's talking about sexual repression, sexual repression being the key to the character that will obey the parental demands. And that goes for whether the demands are stay in school, go to college, and go into your father's business, and all these people obediently follow that, and it takes that kind of repression for a child to just go into that path, whatever the path may be.
If we accept that the living organism, the pulsatory organism, that sexuality or sexual function is an expression of our biological nature, then to talk about human structure, either on an individual level in therapy or on a social level, is to talk about sexuality. And I mean, you always have to raise the question of why individuals are uncomfortable with so much talk of sexuality. One of the anecdotes about Reich was when he gave his first public lecture in front of the psychoanalytic hierarchy of all the bigwigs back in early 1920s. He was received as a wunderkind, but their comment, and these were the psychoanalysts, these were Freud and his circle, saying, did you have to mention sexuality so much? it gets us in trouble.
Can I bring one
yeah.
other thing? Court thinking, the absolute rigid sexually repressed people in terrorist groups, suicide or self-destruction is the final release, the breakdown of all this. It's in the sense of orgasm.
Right.
And then they go to heaven and there are 72 black-eyed virgins.
Right.
And the whole thing is so sexually perverse.
Yeah. Well, again, I think, and I realize I didn't come back to it and pick it up, but if you remember in Mass-Psychology, he describes what the mechanism of what it is that's happening for the individual committing hara-kiri. And most of us don't, pay attention to, the idea of hara-kiri is suicide. But in fact, hara-kiri is the ritual gutting of the organism through the up from the genitals, really, through the diaphragm and across through the heart. And it's usually worked up to a frenzy of ecstasy, and then the head is cut off by the person assisting in it. That's the traditional ritual hara-kiri. But clear from the descriptions, including these kids who got into the planes and the kamikazes, that they would work themselves up into a fever pitch of ecstasy, so that the actual act of suicide becomes the ultimate sexual orgasmic release.
Yeah. Brought back from a scarf which he had taken off a kamikaze pilot. And it was a scarf that showed all possible conceivable sexual positions, including some things which no one would conceive of, including the rape of Chinese women with babies in their arms. But this was wrapped around them as this was their
Right.
thing.
But again, the perversity of this, I think what's often missed by identifying because usually what happens in war, as with the Muslims and the reporting on all this, the terrorism is the emphasis on the brutality and the inhumanity and because that builds a kind of responsiveness of horror, which then can justify our also attacking them. That's part of the mechanism. But what is missed is the consistent pattern across the board on all sides of tapping into the fundamentally blocked energy, the fundamentally blocked sexual function, which then can, if organized effectively or directed effectively, can interface and be used and directed. It's a weapon you talk about ultimate weapons. What's often missed is that some power array it stands is nothing compared to this kind of pervasive weapon. Now it might not be as dramatic as a simple plane flying into a tower, which is quite or kamikazes, which are quite terrifying because we can't imagine individuals operating that way or able to do that. But the more profound issue is less about how many guys are going to fly planes or strap hand grenades to themselves, as the profound, persistent spreading of a kind of vision that allows for an organization of hatred of others and sadistic, gratification through sadistic, through sadistic aggressive impulses towards others who are not of the group. Right? Any other comments, or Dr. Schiff?
Well, I always have, but we're getting kind of late. I do want to just, I think for me and for my perspective, it's continually important is to keep coming back to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, and that kind of dovetails in what Dr. Okay. How do we understand this? We can only understand it through our own organism. And
Right.
For each of us, one of Reich's contributions, and he picked up on this very early on, which later analysts and therapists began to address more fully, is that how do we understand our patients? Well, we understand our patients through our own organs.
Right.
As within the field, and we can feel what they're feeling, we feel it through empathy, and empathy is like this biological resonance that
Right.
happens. And what we also have to be able to feel and perceive is our own character structure, know where our own blocks are. And so I think, like when we talk about sadistic impulses, kind of coming out and what happens when that rage is channeled, and, it's one thing to understand that, but I think it's a deeper thing to also understand it organismically and for ourselves. Yes, I understand it because I can actually feel it. And maybe I can even understand how another can feel.
Right.
And I think when we do that, we're at a better position then to begin to say, well, how do we address this? And how do we treat this? And then we're in a better position to also say, in a broader context, if we are going to eradicate fundamentalism, as Dr. Lewis is saying, we've got to do it on every plane. Because if we just do it as their fundamentalism, we then move into a fundamentalistic position.
Right, and that's the point. I think that's a very good point, I think, to end on, is that
That won't happen.
What?
That won't happen.
That won't happen, what?
That we're going to address fundamentalism and all the character structures, like in, you know.
No, but see, you went to exactly that's not the point that I'm addressing. What I'm saying is, I think the issue is, unless you ultimately understand your own impulse towards fundamentalism, you can wind up basically building a fundamentalist approach to fundamentalism. There's an old. I'll end on a one that there was a Second City, the comedy group back in the improvisation group back in the city, did a wonderful. I always remember back when I was a kid, really impressed with it. A wonderful satirical piece in which sort of post-Nazi, post-Germany, post-World War II Germany, and the TV reporter is interviewing someone in the Black Forest because there have been talks of neo-fascism, neo-Nazi movements developing, and a kid comes in later housing and it's very lively and starts interviewing and saying, well, what about these, I'm not going to do the whole routine, but although I'm tempted, what about these neo-Nazi groups that we hear? Oh, no, we do not allow neo-Nazi groups. As a matter of fact, if there are any neo-Nazi groups, we will eradicate them, and we will solve the neo-Nazi problem immediately, and if necessary, we will round up all neo-Nazis and place them in concentration camps and eliminate them. So again, I thought that was, cut right to, and I think that's, in a more light, but scary note, what Dr. Schiff is pointing at. If we fail to understand ourselves in these, and I think that's one of the things that always touched me about Reich, is that he never had the arrogance of being a brilliant intellectual who was looking at the poor, relatives or the poor people who suffer from these conditions, but that somehow he was, above it all because he saw or understood it. And I think that's the thing, is that if you don't see it in your own behaviors, one of the, to end on, just a more, typical, even in orgonomy, one of the sad results of what goes on in orgonomy is you have different groups, different factions who are absolutely convinced that they have the fundamental truth about orgonomy, and therefore will not tolerate and will attack and isolate and resist any other groups or any other individuals who don't join the fundamentally correct position. And the sad thing there is that it winds up, in a sense, debilitating the possible use of valuable work.
Just one addendum. My first therapist, Dr. Herskowitz, told me at one point, he said that if he himself had not experienced exactly what I was experiencing and worked on it, he would never be able to treat me.
That's right. Well, Reich used to say that if you hadn't experienced this, everyone would assume you're crazy.
Yeah.
Which they mostly do anyway. Okay, I'll speak to you later on.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Let me see if I can. Okay, switch here. We're gonna take it down. Now I gotta put one.